Here we are at the Constitutional Convention in 1787, about 10 years after the adoption and implementation of the Articles of Confederation. As we've discussed, the Articles were set up initially by our founding fathers with a fear of a strong central government, so many of the states were afforded their own powers. The federal government could not tax, could not regulate trade, could not make treaties or declare war. Essentially, it was a figurehead only. 10 years after this was set up, Washington realized that this was an issue, that we had 13 states essentially operating as 13 separate sovereignties with their own court systems, their own laws, and their own currency. So the states met to decide how they were going to change or amend the Articles of Confederation. Delegates began reviewing the Articles of Confederation, and you had some delegates who were kind of presenting ideas that were little, and you have a strong central government, but you also have a bicameral legislature, and which means two houses. In that, you would have your House of Representatives and the House of Representatives, as well as the Senate, would have representation that was based proportionally, meaning that your population of your state determined how many people would represent you in both of those houses. It also gave strong power to the central government, allowing them to regulate interstate trade, to strike down laws that were deemed unconstitutional, and also to call armies, used armed forces, and to enforce laws in general, which they had previously not been able to do. So this sounded great to the states that were big. However, the states that were smaller, say Delaware, the smallest, said, hey, that's not cool, because they recognized that they would not have a lot of representation in the government, and they were not okay with that. So then what you had is you had the New Jersey Plan introduced by William Patterson, and what this called for was a unicameral legislature with each state had one vote, and it didn't matter how big they were. You had some provisions that the plan didn't have. They did want the government to add powers to tax and to regulate commerce, to name the national government, but they didn't want one person in charge. And this appealed to the smaller states because they would have the ability to have proportional or equal representation. So we have both of these plans presented, and then you have Roger Sherman in what he... So we have two plans that have been put forth, and there were strong points and weak points in each one. So then you have Roger Sherman come in, and he's responsible for what's known as the Great Compromise. He listens to what both sides want, the small states and the large states, and he proposes that we do have a bicameral legislature, in that we have equal representation in the Senate, which is what made the small states happy, and then we would have representation in the House of Representatives that was based on proportional population. So that was kind of the best of both worlds as far as that was concerned. And that we would have a court system, and that the strong central government would have one leader, and that leader would oversee what was going on in the nation. Additionally, the federal government was given the power to impose taxes, to call armies, to regulate trade, to make treaties, etc. What we start looking at, however, is an argument about representation as far as population. Representation becomes a big issue. The southern states wanted to be able to count their slaves as part of their population. Therefore, that would give them more people to represent them in Congress. Therefore, they would have a stronger say in influencing the government. The northern states were not okay with that. Or they said, that's fine. If you want to count them as people, then you also need to be taxed with them as people. So that caused some division. And finally, the agreement that was come upon was called the Three-Fifths Compromise, in which they agreed that 5 slaves would be equal to 3 white men. So you could take your slave population and you could count them, but they weren't going to be on an equal basis as the white men. So that way they could increase them by their population, but not overly indulge in that. But they also would be taxed that way. So then they wouldn't be taxed on 5 people, they'd be taxed on 3. But they would be given 3 in their count so that they would be able to have higher representation. With this compromise, as well as the Great Compromise spearheaded by Sherman, it was agreed with the addition of a Bill of Rights that we would write and ratify a new Constitution and do away with the Articles of Confederation altogether.